The year was 1305 and London stank of piss, horse dung, and rotten fish. The streets were already noisy with vendors barking like mangy dogs, clattering hooves hammering against cobblestones, and the general chaos of a city too fat with greed. But on that August morning, another sound slithered into the air, a roar swelling from thousands of throats. The kind of roar only a blood-drunk mob can make when they smell a man about to be butchered. The mob wasn't there for a sermon or a festival or to see some poxy juggler toss balls in the air. No, they were gathering for the kind of show England had perfected. The destruction of a human being, paraded like a circus animal, ripped apart in full view, so the crowd could gnaw on his agony like cheap meat. The victim, William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had the gall, the sheer audacity to stand against England's bloated tyrant, King Edward I. Forget the Hollywood fairy tales. Forget Mel Gibson screaming freedom like some sweaty martyr. The truth was uglier, darker, and stitched together with pure venom. Edward Longshanks, the bony freak with a heart as black as coal, wasn't handing Wallace a clean, quick death. He wanted a masterpiece of cruelty, an execution that would piss fire into Scotland's memory for centuries. This wasn't about ending one man's life. It was about burning his very name into ash, breaking his legend bone by bone, until even his shadow was too terrified to remain in England's air. The sentence chosen was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The nuclear option of medieval sadism. This wasn't death. Death would have been merciful, something Wallace had earned in battle years earlier. No, this was theater. Theater funded by the English crown, written by a king whose only script was humiliate, mutilate, annihilate. It was about making sure every Scot who even sneezed in England's direction thought twice, then choked on the thought. But to understand why Wallace ended up dragged to this carnival of carnage, you have to look at the world around him. Scotland wasn't some tidy kingdom waving tartan flags. It was a battered land caught between independence and subjugation, where the word nation was still a half-formed curse. Survival often meant licking boots instead of lifting swords, and into this cesspit stepped Wallace, not a pampered noble, not a preening aristocrat, but a landowner who had watched his family and people trampled into mud. When he picked up a sword, it wasn't for glory. It was because he was burning with a fury only the dispossessed know. At Stirling Bridge in 1297, Wallace smashed English cavalry and proved the impossible, that the mighty war machine of Edward could be beaten. That day was more than a victory. It was a slap in the face to the English crown. Wallace had made Edward look like a fool, a deadly crime in itself. But Edward wasn't a man who simply forgave humiliation. This was the same king who crushed Welsh resistance, expelled Jews from England, and strangled mercy in his cradle. He knew rebellion was a fire. If not stomped out with steel boots, it spread. Wallace wasn't just a thorn, he was a plague rat carrying rebellion in his teeth. And Edward swore he'd gut him for it. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had already bent the knee, drooling like dogs at Edward's table. Wallace, though, refused to lick the king's hand. That made him not just a rebel, but an embarrassment. To the Scottish aristocracy, who had chosen comfort over blood, Wallace's defiance was a mirror showing their cowardice. That's why his capture was a priority, not just for Edward, but for the sellouts who feared that his very existence made them look like traitorous worms. And betrayal, as always, came from within. Wallace was snatched near Glasgow, thanks to Sir John Menteith, a knight who proved once again that greed and cowardice rot men faster than plague. Whether it was for gold, power, or simple survival, Menteith sold Wallace out like spoiled meat at market. The English celebrated, cackling like drunkards, but for Edward, Wallace in chains wasn't enough. He wanted the man dragged through the mud, spat on, broken, and paraded as a warning. The capture was just the opening act of this blood play. Dragged to London, Wallace was shoved through towns like some monstrous trophy. Crowds jeered, spat, and laughed as if they'd just seen Satan himself bound in ropes. It wasn't enough to kill him. They needed to strip him of dignity inch by inch. This was psychological warfare. Medieval edition, make the hero into a freak show, the knight into a carnival attraction. By the time Wallace reached London, he had endured weeks of degradation. But the English weren't done. They had saved the best stage for last. The trial, if you can call it that, was a joke spat in Latin, a language Wallace probably didn't even understand. On August 23, 1305, in Westminster Hall, he was charged with treason, murder, arson, sacrilege. Every word thrown like rotten fruit at his face. Treason? Against a king he never swore loyalty to? That was the absurdity. Wallace wasn't Edward's subject, and yet he was accused of betraying him. When he finally got a chance to respond, Wallace flung the venom back. "I cannot be guilty of treason, for I was never your subject." A middle finger in words, hurled straight at Longshank's rotting heart. The outcome, of course, was already carved in stone. The judges were Edward's lapdogs, his legal hitmen. They weren't there to decide. They were there to condemn. The charges were stitched carefully to justify what was about to come, the grand finale of cruelty: hanging, drawing, quartering. A death so obscene it was meant to turn Wallace into less than a man, less than an animal, just a carcass, butchered for royal entertainment. And so the venomous theater prepared for its star. August 23rd, 1305. London woke up like it was Christmas morning, except the gift wasn't joy. It was a man's agony, wrapped in chains and tied to a wooden hurdle. William Wallace, Scotland's rebel knight, was about to be turned into a meat show. And the English crowd, always hungry for blood, flooded the streets to watch him destroyed. This wasn't a trial anymore. This was entertainment, a carnival of cruelty. The sentence was clear. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets, then hanged, but not until dead, then butchered alive like an animal in a slaughterhouse. Each step of the process was designed not only to kill him, but to grind his dignity into dust. Drawing, hanging, disemboweling, quartering. The medieval menu of terror, cooked up by Edward Longshanks, England's bony tyrant with a taste for human suffering. Wallace was stripped and bound to the hurdle, a crude wooden frame that scraped along the cobblestones. Horses dragged him like garbage through London's busiest districts. Every stone ripped at his flesh, every bump tore skin from bone, and the mob shrieked in delight. Blood smeared the cobbles behind him like a trail, as if London itself was drinking his pain. This wasn't a journey, it was a rolling torture chamber. The route wasn't random. Oh no, Edward's men had carefully plotted it like sadistic event planners. Wallace was paraded through the busiest markets, the busiest alleys, so the maximum number of English pigs could watch him suffer. Housewives screamed curses. Drunkards hurled rotten vegetables. Kids laughed like demons. Wallace wasn't just being killed, he was being reduced into a spectacle, stripped of humanity so thoroughly that people felt entitled to spit on him like he was less than dirt. The air was thick with jeers and rotten fruit, as if the entire city wanted to throw their filth at him. Vendors even set up stalls to sell food and ale to the spectators, because why not feast while a man was tortured alive? This wasn't just an execution, it was a medieval theme park where pain was the attraction and cruelty was currency. And yet, through all this, accounts say Wallace stayed conscious, his body mangled, dragged, and bleeding, but his eyes remained open, fixed somewhere distant. Some said he stared past the mob, past the horses, past the slime of London, as if daring to see a world beyond their cruelty. He didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't whimper. The crowd wanted tears and sobs, but he denied them the satisfaction. That defiance, that silence, cut deeper than any knife. Even in chains, he made them look small. But that didn't stop the mob. Oh no, they had their orders: to humiliate, degrade, and annihilate him. Every curse shouted at Wallace was really a cheer for Edward, the puppet master pulling the strings. The English crown didn't just want Wallace dead, it wanted him erased, turned into a moral scarecrow hanging over Scotland's future. By the time Wallace reached Smithfield, the infamous execution ground, his body was raw from the dragging. Flesh shredded, bones bruised, blood seeping. The mob had grown thicker, louder, hungrier. They had been whipped into a frenzy, a seething pack of hyenas. Scaffolds had been erected for the best view. Families brought children to watch. Merchants sold pies, beer, and trinkets, like it was a festival. London had dressed itself for murder. The authorities wanted this to feel like a holiday, not a martyrdom. This was meant to be spectacle, not sacrifice. They wanted Wallace remembered not as a hero, but as a piece of butchered meat. And the crowd played along, laughing and jeering as if they weren't witnessing state-sponsored sadism, but a grand parade. At Smithfield, Wallace was yanked from the hurdle and hauled before the scaffold. His trial had been a farce, his sentencing a death warrant. Now came the real performance. The executioner, a seasoned butcher of men, was waiting, tools ready, hands steady. This wasn't his first slaughter, and it wouldn't be his last. For him, Wallace was just another body to slice open, another performance to keep the crowd cheering. The hanging began, not the merciful neck snap kind, but the slow, choking dance of strangulation, rope tightening, lungs starving, face turning the color of bruised meat. Wallace writhed in that universal twitching agony of asphyxiation. The mob roared, children clapped, mothers cheered. This was England's justice, turned suffering into theater. But Edward hadn't ordered death yet. No, mercy wasn't in the script. Just before the rope could steal Wallace's last breath, the executioner cut him down. Wallace collapsed, still alive, gasping, choking, but aware. A broken man's body, but not a broken spirit, and that was when the real nightmare began. Because the English weren't there to kill him quickly. They were there to make him scream. The rope had nearly done its work. Wallace's body twitching, his face a grotesque mask of suffocation. But mercy was not in the script. Edward's lackeys weren't paying for quick deaths. They were staging a carnival of torment. And so the executioner, a seasoned ghoul with hands stained in the misery of dozens before, cut Wallace down. He hit the ground like a sack of shattered bones, chest heaving, eyes open. Alive, suffering exactly as planned. The mob erupted. They hadn't come for silence. They'd come for screams. And they were about to get them. The executioner moved in, not with pity, but with the precision of a butcher carving a hog. Except this hog was a knight, a man, a symbol, and that made the cruelty sweeter. A blade flashed, then the real horror began. The executioner plunged his knife into Wallace's abdomen and dragged it downward. Skin split like old leather. Muscle tore. Blood spilled hot and steaming onto the scaffold. Wallace's body jerked, his mouth opened, not in some noble cry of freedom, but in a guttural howl ripped from the pit of hell. The crowd roared louder, their hunger finally fed. Piece by piece, the executioner pulled out Wallace's organs. First came loops of intestine, gleaming and wet, held aloft like trophies. He didn't just cut, he performed. Each slick rope of flesh was lifted high for the mob to see, then tossed into the fire set blazing beside the scaffold. The smell hit them next. Burning meat, acrid and vile. It filled the air, seeped into the clothes and nostrils of every gawking spectator, marking them as accomplices to this state-sponsored butchery. In medieval belief, the bowels were the seat of compassion, the soul's tender core. By burning Wallace's intestines while he watched, Edward's little show wasn't just killing him. It was annihilating his humanity in front of everyone. Look, the fire hissed. Even his guts betray him? This was no execution. It was ritual humiliation, twisted theater at its foulest. The crowd's reaction was a nightmare chorus. Some gagged at the smell, others laughed through it, and still more screamed approval like pigs squealing at slop. Vendors shouted above the din, selling pies and ale to people whose hands still clutched crumbs while they watched a man's body dismantled alive. This was the sickness of spectacle. Cruelty packaged as entertainment, barbarity celebrated as justice. Wallace, somehow, impossibly, remained conscious through it. His eyes, wide and glassy, stayed open, fixed on the fire that devoured his insides. Some accounts say he even tried to speak, though the words are lost to history. Perhaps curses, perhaps prayers, or maybe silence was the only answer left in a world this poisoned. The English wanted cries of surrender, pleas for mercy. Instead, they got endurance, a final spit of defiance that enraged them more than any sword stroke. The executioner didn't rush. This was his craft, his stage. He wanted Wallace to last, to squirm, to suffer. Every slice was deliberate, every display calculated. He wasn't just killing Wallace. He was playing Wallace like an instrument, each cut a note, each scream a song for the mob. Death wasn't the end here. Death was the punchline. And Edward wanted the joke to last as long as possible. By now, the scaffold reeked. Blood pooled. Smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of roasted flesh into the London air. The mob inhaled it like perfume, forever binding their memories to this day. Wallace's agony became part of the city itself, etched into its stones, carried in the breath of its people. And through it all, the executioner kept his victim alive. That was the art, to destroy without ending, to stretch suffering until the line between life and death blurred into something obscene. Wallace's body was breaking, but his eyes stayed open, his spirit refusing to shatter even as his organs turned to ash before him. Finally, when the butchery had gone as far as spectacle demanded, the axe was raised. Death, after all that, wasn't mercy. It was just the final beat in Edward's grotesque symphony. The executioner had carved Wallace like a carcass in a slaughterhouse, spilling his guts and burning them while his eyes were still open. The crowd had drunk its fill of screams, but Edward's theater wasn't over. No, the finale had to be spectacular. This wasn't just about death. It was about erasing Wallace piece by piece, turning his body into a grotesque billboard for English power. When the organs were ash, the butcher reached for his axe. It wasn't some noble sword stroke Wallace would have wanted, a clean finish on the battlefield. It was a butcher's tool, heavy, crude, perfect for chopping meat. Wallace, half dead already, lay splayed across the scaffold, chest ragged, stomach hollow, blood everywhere. His face was drained, but his eyes, those damned eyes, were still awake, still staring. Even in ruin, he refused to give the mob the collapse they wanted. The axe came down in one vicious swing. Crack. His head snapped away from his body, blood spurting like a fountain across the boards. The crowd screamed with delight. For them, this was the climax, the orgasm of cruelty. The head, slick and dripping, was lifted high by the executioner's hand. Thousands roared as he paraded it around like a prize chicken. Wallace was finally silent, but the silence was drowned under the mob's bloodlust. But the humiliation didn't end with death. Edward wanted Wallace broken beyond recognition. The executioner moved on to quartering, a task less about efficiency and more about message. The body, still warm, was hacked apart limb by limb. One arm, then the other, then the legs. Each quarter was lifted up like cuts of pork at a butcher's stall, displayed for the jeering crowd. "Look!" the axe screamed. "This is what happens when you spit at England's crown." It wasn't just mutilation, it was propaganda. Wallace's humanity was stripped the way you strip skin from a carcass. The mob clapped like they were at a fairground. Vendors kept shouting, hawking food and drink as if dismemberment was just another sideshow act. The smell of blood mixed with roasted entrails still lingered in the air, turning the scene into something almost unholy. The disposal of his remains was as cruelly calculated as the execution itself. His head was boiled in tar to preserve it, because even death wouldn't be allowed dignity. Then it was mounted on a spike above London Bridge, a blackened trophy grinning down at passers-by. For years, Londoners walked beneath that tar-soaked skull, reminded daily of Edward's justice. Wallace's head wasn't buried. It wasn't honored. It was turned into a traffic sign for tyranny. The quarters of his body were distributed like macabre gifts across Britain. Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. Each city received its piece of Wallace, nailed up for the public like butcher's cuts in a shop window. Mothers dragged their children to point at them. Men muttered warnings to each other. The lesson was carved in rotten flesh. Defy Edward, and this is your fate. You don't just die, you're erased, scattered, humiliated in death as much as in life. It was political communication at its most vile. Each limb was a message, a physical reminder nailed into Scotland's consciousness. You are owned. You are nothing. Resist, and you'll be carved like this. Edward didn't need to send armies into every Scottish town when Wallace's quartered body could do the job for him. His cruelty was efficient, portable, and unforgettable. For the English crown, this was a victory, a rebel silenced, a nation humiliated, a symbol dismantled and mailed out like grim souvenirs. Edward strutted in his court, believing he had erased Wallace forever, believing fear would keep Scotland in its chains. But cruelty is a double-edged blade. Edward thought he had written the last chapter of Wallace's story. Instead, he had made it eternal. Every grotesque detail, every scream, every hacked limb became part of the legend. Wallace, cut into pieces, became larger than life. His head on a spike was meant to terrify, but it became martyrdom. His quarters were meant to scatter his legacy, but they carried it farther. Edward wanted obliteration. What he got was fire. Edward Longshanks thought he had done it. He thought his little theater of cruelty, the dragging, the hanging, the gut-burning, the chopping, the parading of body parts, had crushed Scotland's will to fight. In his mind, Wallace was nothing more than ashes, bones, and tar, dangling on spikes like a grotesque trophy. He believed fear had won, but tyrants always miscalculate. Cruelty never silences. It festers, it ignites, it feeds the very rebellion it seeks to choke. In the short term, yes, Wallace's execution sent ripples of terror through Scotland. Men looked at the spikes, at the dangling flesh nailed above city gates, and trembled. Families whispered Wallace's name in the dark like it was cursed. Cowards slithered back into English service, muttering that no dream of freedom was worth being gutted alive. For a moment, Edward's gamble looked clever. Scotland seemed broken, its resistance trampled beneath his bony feet. But cruelty is a poison that doesn't just kill, it lingers. The spectacle of Wallace's destruction, meant to erase him, instead carved him deeper into the memory of his people. Scots didn't forget the smell of burning guts, or the sight of their champion paraded through English streets. They didn't forget the tar-soaked head leering from London Bridge. They didn't forget the quarters of his body, nailed like butcher's meat across their land. They didn't forget because Edward made damn sure they couldn't. And what tyrants never learn is this: when you turn a man into a symbol, you lose control of the story. Edward wanted to show strength, but all he showed was sadism. He wanted to prove England's power, but he proved its cruelty. He wanted to kill Wallace the man, but instead he birthed Wallace the martyr. The English crown could chop his body into 4 pieces, but it couldn't quarter his legend. That legend spread like wildfire, carried by the very brutality meant to kill it. Wallace's death became a rallying cry, a venom-soaked reminder that submission meant chains. But resistance, however bloody, meant dignity. Robert the Bruce, Scotland's future king, saw the truth in Wallace's execution. He saw that Edward's justice was nothing more than torture dressed in law. He saw that capture meant degradation, humiliation, annihilation. And he swore he would never let himself fall into English hands the way Wallace had. For the Scots who fought after, the lesson was brutal but clear. No surrender, no mercy, no begging. Better to die in the mud with a sword in your hand than to end up on an English scaffold. Your guts roasted for a carnival crowd. Wallace's death didn't kill the rebellion, it hardened it. It made the war bloodier, meaner, more desperate. And Edward? He left behind a reputation soaked in filth. His cruelty wasn't admired, it was feared. And fear is a brittle thing. Across Europe, kings and nobles watched the Wallace spectacle with disgust. They saw England's crown not as noble but as monstrous, a kingdom that didn't govern, but mutilated. Edward's message of strength had landed, but so had his message of barbarity. England's name was stained with Wallace's blood, and it reeked. The legacy of Wallace's execution didn't rot on those spikes. It grew, it swelled. In the centuries that followed, his story became the backbone of Scottish identity. Ballads, poems, legends, all of them whispered the same venom. Wallace had suffered, but he had not bowed. His silence in the face of torment became louder than any English decree. His mutilated body became a banner. His butchered death, a seed of vengeance. Even the English scribes, who thought they were writing propaganda, left behind too much detail. Chroniclers described the spectacle in almost pornographic precision. The dragging, the screams, the entrails in the fire. Their words, meant to frighten, became evidence of England's cruelty and proof of Wallace's endurance. The English wrote his horror, and the Scots read it as heroism, a perfect inversion. Edward couldn't control the ink any more than he could control the flames that burned Wallace's insides. Wallace's execution was supposed to be an ending. Instead, it became a beginning. Edward wanted to erase his name, but he etched it into eternity. He wanted to destroy Scotland's will, but he fueled it with blood. He wanted Wallace forgotten, but he made him immortal. And that's the venomous truth about tyranny. Cruelty doesn't scare forever. It rots, it backfires, it feeds the very rage it seeks to silence. Edward Longshanks thought he had broken William Wallace. What he really broke was the illusion that England's cruelty could crush Scotland's spirit. Wallace died butchered, but he lived on as a nightmare for Edward's crown. His blood turned into ink, his screams into legend, his body into a weapon sharper than any sword. Edward wanted to annihilate him. Instead, he made him eternal. Edward thought he had burned Wallace out of existence, but cruelty has a way of backfiring. Wallace's blood soaked into London's cobbles, his screams hung in the air, and his hacked remains whispered vengeance across Scotland. The king wanted silence. What he got was an echo that never died. Every spike, every flame, every jeer from that mob only carved Wallace deeper into legend. His guts fed the fire, but his name fed rebellion. And centuries later, people still spit Longshanks' name like poison, while Wallace's story burns hotter than ever. The tyrant tried to turn a man into meat, Instead, he forged a martyr.